Hello and welcome to WooWoo 101 Astrology Natal Chart Reading Basics. This is a workshop intended for anyone who wants to learn more about astrology, wants to understand how to read their chart, but when you look at it, at the circle and the lines and all of that, it makes no sense to you. And that is why you're tuning into this workshop. It should be about 15 minutes and I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I love, the website I prefer to use is called astro.com, Astrodienst. So go ahead on your computer if you choose or wherever and type in astro.com. And this is going to show up for you. And I head over to charts and calculations. And then I like to choose extended chart selection if I want to kind of do more exciting things. But if you just want a quick chart, you're going to click on chart drawing, ascendant. Ascendant means rising. I'm going to actually go back. Let's do extended chart selection because it actually creates a prettier looking chart. So let's go ahead and add a new person. The person I'm going to add today is named Norma Jean Mortensen. Anyone know who that might be? That would be the one and only Miss Marilyn Monroe. And we're going to take a look at Marilyn Monroe's chart in a second. And I haven't done a lot of, looking into her chart, so it'll be fun to do it with you live. So she was born at 9:30 in the morning. This is why the time, your birth time, is so important. What that affects is your ascendant, your rising sign. And if we don't have the exact time of birth, we aren't able to cast a chart that is accurate and gives us the full picture, because having your rising sign is enormously important for astrology. So what happens if you don't have your birth time? You're going to want to go ahead and find your birth certificate. It's often on that. Or you might even have to call the town hall where your birth certificate was recorded to request that information. It is public record, so you should be able to, get it in some fashion, but it might take a little bit of digging. It is worth it though, when you learn just how much it affects your reading. So here we have Norma Jean Mortensen, also known as Miss Marilyn Monroe. And this is her beautiful chart here. And right off the bat, if this looks like absolute gibberish, that's fine. We're going to get into it. First and foremost, let's look at this outer circle full of symbols. Many of you may recognize them as the astrology symbols. And they go in, counterclockwise order. So I'm actually able to annotate this. So I'm going to show you just by drawing. We have here Aries, and then it goes in order through the zodiac: Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo. And notice this term here, this AC, this tells us what the ascendant is for the person whose chart you're looking at. In this case, we have Marilyn Monroe is a Leo rising. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Then there's Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. And the colors of each one of the signs does matter. You'll notice that Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius are all red, and red signs are also known as fire signs. Then we have Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, all green for earth signs. Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, all yellow for air signs. And then Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, all blue for water signs. The next thing that we're going to notice is the smaller circle, this blue circle here within the larger one. And it's broken into different shapes. Now, what I choose to use is what's called Placidus astrology, and that's the default on astrodienst.com. You'll notice it says it here, Placidus. That means that the house sizes vary, and it's based on the time of year, and it's based on all these astronomical things that it's above my head. But all I need to know is that the house sizes are going to vary when we use Placidus. There is also whole house signs, which means that, you know, it's a one-to-one correlation where each sign, each astrological sign has an exact matchup with a house. And that just, to me, I think is oversimplification. So if you like it to be a little bit more nuanced, then Placidus is for you. And really it's up to you. Every astrologer, you know, has their own method that works. I find Placidus to be really, really accurate. So in this case, we have the first house outlined here, and then the second house, you know, and this would be the line in between each one. And these tell us where in your life this particular planet is going to have the most influence. And actually, there is a relationship where the first house has a lot to do with the same issues that Aries, the first sign of the zodiac, rules. Second house is going to be a lot to do with Taurus. Third house is going to be a lot to do with Gemini, and so on and so forth. So for example, let's back up here and look at Norma Jean Mortensen's sun sign. So what we want to do is, first of all, scroll down here, and this is going to show us exactly what each symbol is for the planets. And in astro.com, it comes with also the mean node, which we'll talk about later, Chiron, which is a really important asteroid, Lilith, another important asteroid. I add the part of fortune, which is just something personal that I like, and I've saved to all of my charts. And then down here is a little bit more information. This tells us what degree the rising sign is. Remember AC. It also tells us the second house cusp is at 6 degrees in Virgo. The third house cusp is in 3 degrees Libra. And these, of course, also apply to the opposite houses that they have. That's why they only show these 6 houses, because it's the same across the circle, right? So all of this is to say, let's first look at, let me delete those, undo. Let's first look at Norma Jean Mortensen's sun sign, Marilyn's sun sign, which for her is in Gemini in the 10th house. So we look for it, we see that it is here in the 10th house. And we also notice it's actually here, it's right on the cusp, almost in the 11th house. And the way I was able to tell that is that, again, I mentioned that they go counterclockwise. So when we talk about degrees, here we see that she has Mercury, notice the Mercury symbol, conjunct, because they're right next to her sun, which is the sun symbol here, circle within a circle. Now, I notice that Mercury for her is at 6 degrees and the sun is at 10. The degrees go counterclockwise. So this would be 1 degree Gemini, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the longer line, 6 is her Mercury, and then 10 is her sun, which also happens to be right on the cusp of her 11th house. But what's important here is that she is a Gemini and her sun is in the 10th house. So for her, the public opinion that others have of her is what is ruled by the 10th house. That was always very important to Marilyn Monroe. Perfect example, she changed her name to sound more, accepted, to become more accepted by the public. So being in the public eye is what the 10th house rules. Makes a lot of sense that we see Norma Jean Mortensen with that placement for her sun. And the fact that it is conjunct Mercury tells us a little bit more about how she views herself. And this is stuff that you can, research further, but what I really want to go into here is just understanding what the heck this map is showing. Okay, so we looked at her sun sign. Now let's just back up. The other thing that I always talk about is someone's moon. And luckily the moon symbol is pretty easy to spot. It looks like a crescent moon. And for Marilyn, she has her moon in Aquarius and it's in the 7th house. So that tells me two things about her. Her moon has an Aquarian flavor, and it also has the flavor of the 7th house, which again, you can research and look into. The next thing I want to share is, again, let's go back to the rising sign. So sun, moon, rising are going to be the three first things that you look at whenever you look at anybody's chart. Rising sign for Marilyn, as I mentioned, is Leo. Leos love to be the center of attention. And so it makes perfect sense that Marilyn is a Leo rising. Now, the other thing that's important to note here are the angles in general. So this is known as her ascendant. So here we have the rising sign, the ascendant. DC symbolizes her descendant, which is the opposite side of our rising sign. And then we have I'm going to undo those. Then we have what's called the MC. I'm going to do yellow, it's a little bit brighter. We have the MC here, that's also known as the midheaven. And then we have the IC here, which is a Latin word, I should have looked it up before, but it doesn't matter because it just means the opposite of the midheaven. The midheaven often tells us, our focus in life, career-wise, and tells us kind of where we see ourselves in the grander scheme. As I mentioned, that has a lot to do with our 10th house, which we talked about for Marilyn was where her sun is. Now, her 10th house cusp right here tells us that her focus in a lot of things has a Taurian quality. Now, one thing about Taurus is that they're very sensual. So that makes sense when you think about Marilyn Monroe. And they're also really concerned about money and stability and creature comforts. So that makes a lot of sense when you think about her and her life. Now, that gives us a great kind of overview of the sun and moon and rising signs and what we're looking for when we look at them. Another thing to note when you're looking at a rising sign is to always find the ruler of that sign. Leo is ruled by the sun, so that would bring us back to her sun sign, meaning that her sun sign is that much more important for her because she's a Leo rising. Next, it's important to look at this little grid right over here. So, as I mentioned before, we talked about the colors of all the different signs, and those go in order down the left-hand side here. We have fire, air, earth, and water. Then across the top is what's called the modalities. The three modalities are cardinal, which means more active, wanting to do, fixed, a little bit more sedated, maybe more stuck in their ways, and mutable, which is very flexible and kind of goes with whatever everyone else is doing. And based on that, we see kind of where a lot of Marilyn's, energy was. And I always count the moon and the sun and the rising sign as two, kind of, as in they have a little bit more weight than the other planets. And looking at her chart, we see she's got a lot of air, fixed and mutable, and a lot of water, a whole lot of water down here. Air is, being really in your mind. And I think of her as someone who did struggle with anxiety and depression and probably some, negative self-talk. And then she also, was smart. She was a smart woman. And that also can be indicated by air. as well as just her ability to charm. And, air signs are known for being very charming and very sociable and social. Then she has a lot of water. Water tells me that she certainly felt her emotions very, very deeply. And we're going to get into that in a moment. So that is an important thing to note with everyone's chart, including your own. And it gives us kind of a nice overview of kind of also where they're lacking in their chart. Now, one would argue that, Marilyn had almost no earth in her chart natally, which means she was not a very grounded soul. She may have wanted, we talked about how, her midheaven was in Taurus and she wanted creature comforts and she wanted that stability, but she was not able to give it to herself in a lot of ways. And the only thing that we see in Earth is also her Chiron, as well as her midheaven. Chiron is where the wounded, is the asteroid of the wounded healer. So tells us that, part of her wound was not feeling like she had a lot of stability in her life. And that certainly resonates, doesn't it? All right, let us go back now. We're going to look at another thing. So now let's talk about all of these signs in the middle, all these lines in the middle of her chart. What do they mean? Well, first of all, we see red lines and we see blue lines and we see green lines. I personally do not use green lines very often in my readings. The only exception is what's called a yod. So if we were to see, say, a green line here pointing to another green line with a blue line in the middle, that is a special configuration, but we don't have that in her chart. So for the most part, green lines are kind of something that I do not work with, as they're not reflecting the most common alignments or aspects is what they're called. Anytime a planet connects to or affects another planet, we call it an aspect. So these are aspect lines in her chart. I like to start with, let's look first and foremost as we kind of go down through this chart here. So we see this chart tells us exactly how all of her planets aspect each other. So the moon is in a trine. That's a trine symbol. Let me draw on that. The moon is trine her sun. Her moon is conjunct. That's the conjunct symbol to Mercury. We talked about that. It means that they're in alignment. They're on top of each other within 10 degrees. Then I don't talk about any of these green lines. Let's look over at the moon. The moon is conjunct to, this is Jupiter. And the moon is also square, that's a square symbol, to her Saturn. And then moving on to a different aspect pattern we haven't talked about yet is what's called a sextile. Her Venus is sextile to Jupiter. That's a very lucky transit. That's why Marilyn was often in the right place at the right time. It's also a great placement for manifesting money. So no surprise there again. So let's go ahead and look at those signs in the actual map of her natal chart. So the first thing the aspects, I'm sorry. The first thing that we talked about was the fact that her sun is trine her moon. So here we have sun, and see this line right here to her moon. Now it is very, very light. It's not a very thick line here. And the reason for that is that the two, it's within a 10 degree window, orb is what it's called. And in this case, her sun is at 10 degrees, is at 10 degrees Gemini, and her moon is at 19 degrees Aquarius. Yes, they're in a trine aspect, but they're far enough apart that it's not going to show up as a really thick line. Meanwhile, we notice, the connection between, say, her moon and Saturn. This is a square line that is much thicker. because it's a much more exact connection. So looking at her moon at 19 degrees, her Saturn is at 21. That's only a 2-degree difference versus 9 degrees between her sun and moon. So looking at these aspects, we see a few different things. The blue lines that we see here, the longer blue lines are called a trine, and those are harmonious connections, meaning, you know, there's a positive flow of energy here. It's natural. Now we do want to look at the planets involved, which in her case are not exactly easy ones, but the connection between the planets, they get along. So let's look at, Marilyn actually has what's called a grand trine, this big triangle in her chart. And for her, it is in the signs of Cancer, Pisces, and Scorpio. These signs are all in water. Anytime we have a grand trine, it is going to be in a specific element. So for her, it's a grand trine in water. People with grand trine in water have very deep feelings. They're naturally very emotional. They are naturally caring. They are naturally ones who maybe feel others' feelings really strongly and don't know how to separate their feelings from themselves. So that's really interesting. It is also kind of the downside of a trine or a sextile, which here is an example of a sextile, a shorter blue line, also a positive connection for her between Jupiter and Venus, which we talked about. Chiron's in there too, though, so that makes it a little bit more complicated. But that trine, that sextile aspect, the trine aspect, these are things that flow naturally within your personality. The downside, of course, being that they can be something we take for granted and we don't necessarily recognize as a strength or something that we don't develop consciously. It's just there. But we can learn through astrology when we see these things to pay more attention to those patterns and those strengths. Now, the next thing I want to point out is the red lines. Now, there's 3 types of red aspects that we're going to see. The first one is the conjunction, which is kind of hard to notice if they're right on top of each other, but we see a conjunction here between the Sun and Mercury. We see a conjunction here between Mars and Uranus, and a conjunction here between her moon and and Jupiter. So that those are some of her conjunctions. She also has some oppositions. She has this opposition here between Neptune and the moon, and Neptune and Jupiter. Then we see what's called a square for her between the moon and Saturn, Neptune, Saturn. This shape is what's called a T-square in astrology. And T-squares are always going to be in modalities. For her, as we mentioned before, we have it in actually fixed signs. So Aquarius and Scorpio and Leo are all fixed. Now, the thing with squares is that it often is a driver in our personality. It's things that don't sit well with each other. And because of this conflict, it forces us to learn these lessons, often the hard way. That's the downside, is that it can be difficult, but the good side of it is that once we've learned these lessons, it becomes a very solid strength in our personality. So I'm going to go ahead and end there. I hope that this gives you some understanding of how to read a natal chart, the best way to pull it up, the best way to understand it. And then once you can kind of play with this, you can do tons of research. There's so many resources online for understanding what each one of these placements mean for you. Or you can always book a reading with a trained astrologer, such as myself, who can then interpret this even further with you. And I always, in my readings, include this visual so that as you are either live on Zoom with me or watching a recording, you're able to follow along with me. The last thing I do want to mention is that you can always click with transits. Now, obviously Marilyn is no longer with us, so the transits today aren't going to affect her, but this tells you where these planetary bodies are currently, so you can compare them in your chart. So again, this is just a little overview. I hope that you found this informative. And again, if you want more information, you can always head over to my website, ColleenMarieHealing.com, and book a reading or ask me questions. I cannot tell you what a difference astrology has made in my life in helping me understand who I am, as well as the people I love. So I hope that you appreciate it as much as I do. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.